I used to think that Rebecca and I had one of those marriages people envied. You know, the kind where you finish each other's sentences, laugh at the same jokes even when they aren't funny, and always come back home to the person who makes the day's weight a little lighter. For the past 5 years, I was convinced that we were an unshakable team, perfectly aligned in love and ambition. We had our routines: Saturday morning coffee at the corner cafe, weekend hikes in the nearby hills, dinners where we shared stories from our day. Even the quiet moments, sitting in silence as we read or watched TV, felt comforting, like we were exactly where we belonged. But looking back now, it's painfully clear that the day everything changed wasn't some big dramatic event. No, it was subtle, a shift so small at first that I nearly missed it. It was after we returned from that camping trip with Jason. That camping trip should have been nothing out of the ordinary. It was me, Rebecca, and Jason with his crew. Jason, my boss, was his usual self, larger than life, always the center of attention. Rebecca had always gotten along well with him. After all, we'd spent a lot of time with him over the years because of my work. But something about her had changed on that trip. At first, I shrugged it off as post-vacation blues. But then I noticed little things: Rebecca withdrawing, her laughter becoming hollow, her mind somewhere else even when she was sitting right next to me. I told myself it was nothing, that work must be stressing her out. But the distance between us felt like it was growing by the day, and no matter how hard I tried to close it, something was keeping us apart. It was only after we came back home that I started seeing real signs. Like that night, the first night we unpacked, and I threw our clothes into the laundry. I don't usually pay attention to what goes into the wash, but there was something off. One of Rebecca's underwear had these stains that shouldn't have been there. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but deep down I knew. My gut told me something wasn't right, and once that seed of doubt is planted, it's impossible to ignore. I felt like a stranger in my own life. Rebecca became harder to read, her warm eyes colder, her excuses more frequent. She'd come home later than usual, mentioning extra work, catching up with students, or some meaningless errands. But it was her phone that really got to me. She'd always been open with it, leaving it around, not caring who saw what, but now it never left her side. She'd glance at it, smile at messages, then quickly swipe them away. I started noticing how she'd turn her body just slightly when I was nearby, shielding the screen from me. I couldn't stay in the dark anymore. I needed to know, so I reached out to Grace. We hadn't spoken in a few years, but she was always sharp and reliable. Divorce attorney wasn't the friend I wanted to be calling for advice, but here we were. Grace listened patiently as I spilled everything: the doubts, the trip, the laundry, the phone. She didn't jump to conclusions, but her advice was clear: gather evidence. She said it in such a calm, detached way that it felt more like a business transaction than the disintegration of my marriage. I had to be sure before confronting Rebecca. If she was cheating, I'd need proof, not just suspicion. I hated the idea of spying on her, but I couldn't go on feeling like this. That's when Grace introduced me to Mark, a private investigator she trusted. Mark wasn't the kind of guy you'd picture tailing someone. He was casual, almost too relaxed, but Grace assured me he got results. He suggested a few options, the most invasive of which involved installing a tracking app on Rebecca's phone and placing a small audio recorder in her purse. He'd monitor her movements, watch for anything unusual, and report back. Every part of me recoiled at the thought of doing this to her, but the doubt had already sunk its teeth into me. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. The day I left for my business trip was when everything started unraveling faster than I expected. Rebecca offered to drive me to the airport. It felt forced, like she was going through the motions. I kissed her goodbye, but it was the coldest kiss I'd ever felt from her. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she pulled away, and for a brief moment, I saw her reach for her phone before she thought I noticed. She had texted someone, quick, casual, but then deleted it immediately. It was that moment that shattered whatever hope I had left. Something was going on, and now I had no choice but to find out what it was. When I landed in Chicago for the business trip, I should have been thinking about the contract, the meetings lined up, maybe even unwinding at the hotel bar afterward. But Rebecca's face lingered in my mind like a shadow. That cold, indifferent kiss, the way her fingers had danced across her phone before quickly hiding the screen from me, it haunted me. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't stop my imagination from running wild. But what gnawed at me the most was the silence. Rebecca hadn't called, hadn't texted, as if I'd already ceased to exist in her world. 2 days passed, and the unsettling quiet had become unbearable. Mark's updates weren't helping. He sent me daily reports, his tone neutral and professional, but the content was anything but. He'd started tracking Rebecca the moment I left, and the first night was exactly as I expected. She didn't come home right after school. She claimed she was prepping for the new semester, going over lesson plans or organizing some student event, but Mark followed her straight to Jason's house. That first night, she stayed for a couple of hours. I thought maybe it was work-related. Jason had always been the type to mix business with pleasure. But then the second night, she went back. No excuses about lesson plans this time, just a vague text saying she'd be late. Mark followed again, and this time she stayed the entire night. The update was simple. She left Jason's house at 5:30 a.m. By then, my mind had spiraled far past suspicion. But what really set things off was the package Mark sent on the third day. Photos. I opened them slowly, afraid of what I was about to see. And there it was, Rebecca in Jason's arms, her face buried in his neck, her shirt undone just enough to tell me what had happened before the camera clicked. I felt my hands shake as I flipped through the images, each one worse than the last. Jason, the man I worked for, the man I thought I respected, was there with my wife, and from the look on her face, it wasn't the first time. But it didn't stop there. No, the last photo was the one that twisted the knife deeper than I thought possible. It wasn't just Jason. There was another man, Nick. He was Jason's right-hand guy, always hanging around, always laughing at Jason's jokes. And now, apparently, laughing at me. The image was grainy, snapped from a distance, but there was no mistaking it. Rebecca was with them, both of them, and she didn't look like she was being coerced. She looked like she belonged there. I barely remember the rest of that day. The meetings, the presentations, they blurred together. My mind was stuck on those photos, on the betrayal that was now too clear to ignore. But just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, Mark called. "I found something else," he said, his voice even more cautious than before. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "What is it, Mark?" "There's more. She's not just seeing Jason and Nick." "What do you mean?" I asked, though the knot in my stomach already knew where this was going. "There's another. I followed her last night. Jason's son, Chris, was there. He's involved too. I think you need to see the photos." I stood there, silent, as if Mark's words had physically struck me. Jason's son. This was worse than I imagined. I opened the new email Mark sent, hands trembling. And there it was, Rebecca with Chris, and not just him. There were other faces too, men I didn't recognize, probably from Jason's company, all involved in the sick game that had been playing out behind my back. The group setting was so brazen, so far from anything I thought Rebecca could ever be part of, that I barely recognized her in the images. The woman in those photos wasn't my wife. "What do you want me to do?" Mark's voice came through the line, but it sounded distant, like I was underwater. I need more," I finally muttered. "I need every detail." "Understood," he replied. "I'll keep watching." After hanging up, I stared at the phone, my mind trying to comprehend what was happening. Jason, Nick, Chris, and more. How far did this go? How long had it been happening? There was no way to know until Mark had more for me. I thought about confronting her then, but I couldn't yet. Not without everything laid out in front of me. Not without solid proof that would end this charade for good. I went through the rest of the night in a daze. The people at the hotel didn't exist to me. The bustling noise of the city was just background static. All I could think about was what Mark might uncover next, and whether I could stomach knowing the full truth. I called Rebecca that night, trying to sound casual, as if nothing was wrong. She answered after a few rings, her voice light, almost too light. "Hey, babe," she said, her tone trying to sound sweet, but it didn't reach her words. "How's the trip going?" "Fine," I replied, my voice flat, not willing to play along with her charade. "How's everything at home?" "Oh, busy. I've been working late, getting things ready for school." Her lie came so easily, I almost believed it. "Late, huh? How late?" She paused. "Just late enough." You know how it is. Yeah, I muttered, gripping the phone tighter. I know exactly how it is. I could hear the hesitation on her end, like she wasn't sure if I was on to her. But she brushed it off quickly, saying, I miss you. Can't wait till you get home. I forced myself to respond. Me too. The call ended, but the tension stayed. I was trapped in my own life, watching from the outside as everything fell apart. But now that I had a glimpse into what Rebecca had been doing, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be in the dark much longer. When I got back home, everything felt foreign. The house was the same, but there was a heaviness to it now, like the walls were keeping secrets I hadn't been privy to. Rebecca wasn't home yet, of course. She had sent me a quick, dismissive text earlier, something about being busy at school again. Her messages were getting shorter, colder, more calculated. It was as if she wasn't even trying to pretend anymore. The moment I stepped inside, I called Grace. She was the only person who knew the full extent of what I was dealing with, and I needed her to walk me through this next phase before I made any moves. Ethan, she answered on the first ring, her voice calm and professional as always. How are you holding up? Barely, I replied, pacing the living room. It's worse than I thought, Grace. It's not just Jason. She's seeing his son, Chris, too. And there are others. I heard her sigh on the other end, that knowing sound that told me this was about to get even more complicated. You need to be smart here, Ethan. I know you want to confront her, but we can't afford for this to get messy. Not yet. I'm not waiting around forever, I shot back. It's eating me alive. I get that, she said, her tone softening just a little. But if you go after her now without concrete proof of everything, this could end badly for you. Keep it quiet for now. Let's gather more evidence, get our ducks in a row. You don't want her to know you're on to her. Not until you've got the full picture. More evidence? I muttered, running a hand through my hair. How much more can there be? Grace paused. You said there were others, right? There's a bigger picture here. We need to know all the players. Let Mark keep digging. It was hard to argue with her logic, but waiting felt like standing in a burning room, knowing the fire would eventually reach me. Still, Grace was right. If I confronted Rebecca now, she'd twist it around. She was too good at that. And I'd be the one left with nothing but suspicion, not solid proof. I thanked Grace and hung up, the weight in my chest even heavier. I had no choice now but to let Mark continue his work. A few days passed in a blur of uncomfortable silence. Rebecca and I barely spoke when she was home, and when we did, it felt like she was going through the motions, playing the part of a wife but with none of the sincerity. Every time I looked at her, I couldn't stop seeing those photos, her with Jason, Nick, and then Chris. It made my skin crawl. The third night after I returned, Rebecca told me she'd be working late again. This time, it wasn't school she used as an excuse. Jason's throwing a party, she said, without even looking at me as she packed her things. One of the waitstaff got sick, so he asked me to help out. I froze. There it was, Jason's house. The lie was right there, delivered with such ease that I almost believed it for a second. But I knew better. Jason's party was just another excuse, another cover for whatever was really happening behind closed doors. Why you? I asked, trying to sound casual, like I hadn't already pieced it all together. Since when do you play waitress? Rebecca shrugged, not even glancing up from her phone. He's paying well. I figured why not? That knot in my stomach tightened. She didn't even care that I was asking questions. Maybe she thought I was too stupid to figure it out, or maybe she didn't care if I did. Either way, I nodded, forcing myself to smile, and watched as she left the house with a purse full of secrets. I called Mark as soon as she was gone. She's heading to Jason's party tonight. I need you on this. I have a bad feeling. Mark didn't hesitate. Already on it. I'll keep you posted. Hours dragged by. I tried to distract myself with work, but every time I sat down, my mind would drift back to Rebecca. What was she doing right now? What would Mark find this time? When the phone rang around midnight, my heart sank. It was Mark. Ethan, he started, his voice low. We got a problem. What now? I asked, my grip tightening around the phone. I've been following Rebecca's movements, as usual, but tonight I found something bigger. It's not just her messing around with Jason and his crew. She's stealing from you. I dug into her financial records. She's been siphoning money out of your joint account for the past few months. Looks like she's been transferring it to a business Jason set up. My heart stopped. What? How much are we talking? A lot, Mark replied. Tens of thousands. She's been draining your savings bit by bit, keeping it under the radar. It's all linked to Jason's side business. I sank into the couch, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just emotional betrayal anymore. It wasn't just her body she'd been giving away. It was our future, our savings, everything we'd built together. Rebecca wasn't just cheating on me. She was destroying me. You have proof of this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Everything's documented, Mark assured me. I've got it all. Bank statements, transfers, business records. We're talking serious fraud. Fraud, I whispered to myself. It was almost laughable. How had I let it get this far? How had I not seen it? But there was no time to dwell. This wasn't just about catching her in bed with someone else. She was trying to leave me with nothing. No money, no dignity. I needed to move fast. I need all of it, Mark, I said, standing up, my mind racing. Every detail. I'm not letting her take me down without a fight. You'll have it by tomorrow, Mark promised before hanging up. I stared at the phone, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Grace had been right. This was bigger than just infidelity. It was a complete betrayal on every level. I couldn't afford to sit back and wait anymore. It was time to strike, but I had to be smart about it. I couldn't let Rebecca know I was onto her. Not yet. Not until I had everything I needed to burn her entire world to the ground. I returned home earlier than planned. I wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow, but I couldn't wait. After everything Mark uncovered, I needed to act, and I needed to do it now. My mind was racing as I drove back. I'd rehearsed the confrontation 100 times in my head, imagining how it would go down. Every scenario ended the same. Rebecca trying to lie, twist things, manipulate. But this time, I had more than suspicions. I had proof, hard evidence, the kind that couldn't be denied or explained away. When I walked through the door, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. No signs of Rebecca yet. I knew she was still at Jason's, probably thinking she'd get home before I did. I dropped my bags by the door and sat down at the kitchen table, waiting. My phone buzzed. Mark's latest update. She's still at Jason's house. Mark had texted. Left around 7 a.m. last time. Same routine tonight? My blood boiled. She'd be sneaking in early, probably hoping I'd still be on my business trip, none the wiser. The sheer audacity of it made me clench my fists. I replied with a short, "Got it. Thanks." I didn't have to wait long. It was barely after 1 a.m. when the front door creaked open. Rebecca walked in, tiptoeing, thinking she was being subtle. I watched her from the kitchen, her head turned to the side as she gingerly closed the door, her heels in her hand. She didn't see me at first, and for a brief moment, I could almost pretend nothing was wrong, almost. But then she turned, her eyes widened, and she froze. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her. I stood up slowly, folding my arms. "You didn't expect me to be here, did you?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an excuse, a story, anything that could explain why she was creeping into her own home in the middle of the night. I thought you were still out of town. What are you doing back?" I could see the panic building behind her eyes, but she was still playing it cool. I gestured to the chair at the table. "Sit." Rebecca hesitated, her mind clearly working overtime to assess what I knew and what I didn't. But she sat down, placing her heels on the floor, her hands nervously wringing together. I pulled out my phone and laid it on the table between us, the evidence only a few taps away. "You want to tell me what's been going on?" I asked calmly, though every word felt like acid in my throat. She blinked, playing dumb. "What are you talking about?" I shook my head. "Let's not do this, Rebecca. Not tonight. I know everything." A flicker of something crossed her face, fear, maybe, or guilt. But she kept her composure, leaning back slightly, as if she could somehow distance herself from the mess she created. "Ethan, I don't know what you think you know, but..." I cut her off. "Jason, Nick, Chris, you've been sleeping with all of them. I've seen the photos, Rebecca. Don't lie to me." Her face paled. The smugness drained from her expression in an instant, replaced by pure, unfiltered panic. She stammered, her words tumbling over themselves. Ethan, it's not what you think. Oh, really? I snapped, pulling out my phone and opening Mark's photos. I slid the phone across the table, watching her eyes dart down to the images. There she was in Jason's arms, in his bed with Nick, and there with Chris doing things I never imagined her capable of. I'm not blind, I added coldly. You've been playing me for a fool. Rebecca's hands trembled as she swiped through the photos, her face contorting with each one. Ethan, please let me explain. Jason, he manipulated me. He's been pressuring me for months. It wasn't like I wanted this. I never meant for it to go this far. I still love you. I laughed bitterly. Love me? Is that what you were thinking about when you were sneaking off to sleep with him during the camping trip? Or when you dragged our money into his business? Her eyes widened, and for the first time, real fear crept in. The money, you know about that? I slammed my hand down on the table, making her flinch. I know everything, Rebecca. You've been stealing from me, from us, funneling money into Jason's business while screwing him behind my back. Her face crumbled, and she started to cry, pathetic, shallow tears. I'm sorry, Ethan. Please, I didn't mean for this to happen. Jason, he took advantage of me. Just as I was about to respond, the front door swung open, and Jason walked in, casual as ever, as if he belonged in my house. He didn't even seem surprised to see me sitting there, facing Rebecca like I was interrogating her. You're back early, he said, leaning against the doorframe with that cocky grin plastered on his face. Jason, I said, my voice low, get the hell out of my house. But he didn't move. He just smiled wider. I'm guessing you've had the talk. You know, the truth about what's been going on. I shot to my feet, ready to throttle him. You think this is funny? You've been screwing my wife, stealing from me, and you have the balls to show up here? Jason shrugged, completely unbothered. Oh, come on, Ethan. You can't honestly believe this is all Rebecca's fault. She wasn't exactly hard to convince. In fact, she was the one sneaking into my tent during the camping trip. Remember that time you and the guys went out skiing? She was in my tent, begging for it. I lunged at him, but he stepped back, laughing. Careful there, Ethan. You don't want to do something stupid. But before I could say anything, the door banged open again, and Nick stumbled in, followed by Chris, both of them clearly drunk. Nick's face lit up when he saw me, as if the whole situation was some kind of twisted joke. Well, look who's here, Nick slurred. The husband finally found out. Chris laughed, swaying as he leaned against the wall. We've all had our turn, Ethan. It's not just Jason. You know that, right? We all had a little fun with her. That did it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I lunged at Jason, my fist connecting with his jaw before I even knew what was happening. He stumbled back, grabbing the edge of the doorframe to steady himself, but the smug grin was still there. Go ahead, he taunted. Hit me again. See what it changes. Rebecca screamed, standing up and pulling at my arm, but I shrugged her off, the rage burning hotter than ever. I wanted to destroy him, all of them, for what they'd done. But deep down, I knew this wouldn't fix anything. This was just the beginning of the end. I stepped back, breathing hard, my hands shaking with fury. Get out of my house. All of you. Now. Jason straightened up, rubbing his jaw, but still, that cocky smirk didn't leave his face. You'll be hearing from me soon, Ethan, he said, heading for the door. And trust me, this is far from over. Nick and Chris followed him out, laughing like idiots, as if this whole thing was just a game. But the second they were gone, the house felt emptier than ever, like a void had opened up in the space where my life used to be. Rebecca stood there, her face tear-streaked and panicked. Ethan, please, don't leave me. I can fix this. I'll make it right. But I just shook my head, disgusted. You can't fix this, Rebecca. It's done. The house was quiet now. Jason, Nick, Chris, all of them were gone. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt more like the calm before another storm. Rebecca stood there, staring at me with that mixture of guilt and desperation I had seen too many times. She was still trying to process that this wasn't some minor fight we could fix with an apology. Ethan, she whispered, her voice cracking. You don't mean that. You can't just walk away from us. I looked at her, The woman I once loved, the woman I thought I knew, and all I saw was a stranger. Everything we'd built, everything we were supposed to be, had been buried under layers of betrayal. The lies, the affairs, the money, none of it could be undone now. "There's no us anymore, Rebecca," I said flatly. "You made sure of that." Her face crumpled as the weight of my words settled in. She sank down into the chair at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice desperate. "I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that even surprised me. "You didn't mean to hurt me? You were sneaking off to Jason's house, draining our savings and sleeping with half the men you know, including his son. How exactly did you think this was going to end?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I was done with the tears. I couldn't believe anything she said, couldn't trust her words, not after everything I'd uncovered. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about how deeply she had betrayed me on every level. "Please," she whispered. "I can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head slowly. "No, Rebecca, you can't fix this. You destroyed it." I turned my back on her and walked into the office, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore, couldn't stand the pathetic pleading. She wasn't the woman I thought I married, and the worst part was realizing that she probably never had been. That was a hard truth to swallow, but the evidence had made it all too clear. She had made her choices long before I found out. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my phone. The next steps were already in motion. I called Grace, and she picked up almost immediately. She had been waiting for this call. "Ethan," she said, her voice calm and steady as always. "Are you ready?" I sighed, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. "Yeah, it's time." "Good," she replied without a hint of hesitation. "I'll file the divorce papers first thing in the morning. We're citing adultery. With everything you've given me, the photos, the financial documents, this should move quickly." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "And Jason? I'm filing a lawsuit for alienation of affection against him. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, Ethan, it's a long shot. Most of these lawsuits don't go far, but we might be able to use it to leverage a settlement or at the very least, damage his reputation." That was all I needed to hear. Jason had gotten away with too much already. If I could tarnish his reputation, even if it didn't get me anything legally, it would still be a victory. "And Rebecca?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Grace paused for a moment, her voice softening. "She'll be served with a restraining order along with the divorce papers. You can't have her staying there anymore. She'll have to leave the house." I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I wouldn't have to deal with her lies and presence anymore, but sadness because this was the final nail in the coffin. Whatever we'd had was truly over, and there was no going back. "Do it," I said, my voice steady, though it felt like I was speaking from miles away. "I'll handle it," Grace said. "Now, what about Jason's wife? Do you want to move forward with that?" I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the photos, the videos, the betrayal that Jason's wife probably had no idea about. She deserved to know. She needed to see the truth of the man she was married to, just like I had seen the truth about Rebecca. "Yeah," I finally said, "send her the evidence. She deserves to know what kind of man Jason really is." Grace didn't ask any more questions. She understood. "I'll make sure it's done discreetly. You focus on getting things in order on your end. This is going to move quickly." "Thanks, Grace," I said before hanging up. I sat there in the silence of the office for a while, staring at the walls. The reality of what I had just set in motion was starting to sink in. Rebecca was going to be gone soon, out of my life for good. The house would be mine again, but it wouldn't feel like home. Not for a long time. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the office door. I knew it was Rebecca before she even spoke. "Ethan, can we talk?" she asked softly. I didn't respond at first. I wasn't sure if I had anything left to say to her. But after a moment, I got up and opened the door. She was standing there, her eyes red and swollen, her face a mess of guilt and desperation. "What is it?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I know you're filing for divorce," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But can we try to fix this? I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, Ethan, don't give up on us." I looked at her, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness where there used to be love. There's no fixing this, Rebecca. Not after what you've done. Her lip quivered, but I could tell she knew it was over. I still love you, she whispered. Love? I repeated, the words sounding foreign now. Is that what you call what you did? Was it love when you were with Jason? Or Nick? Or Chris? Was it love when you drained our account? Tears spilled down her cheeks again, but I didn't care anymore. The woman standing in front of me wasn't my wife. She was just someone who had destroyed everything we had. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice cold and final. You'll be served with a restraining order. You can't stay here anymore. She looked up at me, her face twisting with a mix of shock and despair. A restraining order? You're kicking me out? You brought this on yourself, Rebecca, I said, stepping back into the office. Now, get out. She stared at me for a long moment, as if she was waiting for me to change my mind, but I didn't. I shut the door behind me, leaving her standing there, broken and alone. I sat back down at my desk and stared at my phone. It was done. There was no going back now. I had to look ahead. The fallout was coming, and I was going to be ready for it. The day the divorce papers were finalized was supposed to feel like a victory. And in a way, it was on paper, at least. I got the house, I got my savings back, and Rebecca walked away with nothing. No alimony, no piece of the life we'd built together. Grace had seen to that. Her expertise and precision cut through the lies and financial trickery, leaving Rebecca standing with empty hands, just as she deserved. But if I'm being honest, it wasn't the overwhelming sense of triumph I thought it would be. It felt more like reaching the end of a marathon I never signed up for. Sure, I crossed the finish line, but I was too exhausted to celebrate. Too burned out by the months of betrayal and deception to feel anything but relief that it was finally over. Rebecca didn't take it well, of course. She had cried, pleaded, even tried to change her story multiple times, but the evidence was irrefutable. When the court ruled in my favor, she looked like a shell of the woman she once was, defeated, hollow, lost. For a moment, I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the photos, the stolen money, the nights spent at Jason's house. No, she made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Grace called me that afternoon, her voice calm as always. It's done, Ethan. Everything's finalized. The house is yours, the accounts are secured. Rebecca has no claim on anything. How are you feeling? I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the quiet street outside. I don't know, I admitted. Relieved, I guess, but it doesn't feel like I won anything. Not really. She was silent for a moment before responding. You've been through a lot. It's normal to feel that way. But you came out on top. You protected what was yours. That's what matters. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Thanks, Grace. I couldn't have done this without you. You're welcome. And one more thing. Mark sent me an update on Jason. That got my attention. What about him? His company is falling apart. Word got out about the scandal, and clients are pulling out left and right. He's hemorrhaging money, selling off assets to cover legal fees and support payments. His wife left him too, filed for divorce as soon as she got the evidence. I couldn't help but smirk. It was fitting. Jason had built his life on arrogance and manipulation, thinking he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Now, everything was crumbling around him. Nick and Chris aren't doing much better, Grace added. Their involvement came to light, and both of them lost their jobs. No company wants to touch them right now. It was a strange feeling hearing about their downfall. For months, I'd fantasized about this moment, about seeing them all suffer the way I had. But now that it was happening, I just felt empty. The anger had burned itself out, leaving nothing but a dull sense of closure. Good, I said simply. They deserve it. After hanging up with Grace, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the walls of the house I now owned alone. It didn't feel like home anymore. Too many memories were stained here. Too many reminders of what had been lost. I needed a fresh start. That's when my phone buzzed again. It was Mark. You might want to sit down for this one, Ethan, his message read. I sighed, wondering what fresh hell he'd uncovered this time. But when I opened the message, I froze. Rebecca has contracted an STD from one of her affairs. The report was included in her medical records, and it wasn't something easily treatable. I leaned back, reading the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Part of me wanted to laugh. It was poetic justice, really. After all the lies, all the destruction, now she was facing something she couldn't hide or manipulate her way out of. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, not since the restraining order had been served. But later that evening, as if on cue, my phone rang. It was her. I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. In the end, I picked up, knowing full well what this was about. "Ethan," she started, her voice small, almost broken. I don't know how to say this." "Just say it," I replied coldly. She took a deep breath. "I'm sick. I contracted something from one of them. I'm not even sure who. It's not something that goes away." I didn't say anything. There was a long silence on the other end. "Please, Ethan," she continued, her voice cracking. "I need your forgiveness. I know I've hurt you. I've ruined everything. But I don't want to die without you at least forgiving me." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. Forgiveness. She wanted that from me, now that her life had fallen apart, now that she was paying the price for her choices. But there was nothing left to give her. No sympathy, no forgiveness. The woman I had once loved had destroyed herself long before this moment. "I can't forgive you, Rebecca," I said finally, my voice flat. "You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences." She started to cry, soft sobs on the other end of the line, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. I was done. Completely and utterly done. "I'm sorry," I added, though I didn't mean it. "But I've moved on. You should too." I ended the call, without waiting for her response, and tossed the phone onto the table. That chapter of my life was closed for good. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to feel. A few days later, I received an email from a rival company, one that had heard about the Jason scandal and knew I was no longer tied to his sinking ship. They were offering me a position, one with better pay and more responsibility. It was the fresh start I needed, the beginning of a new life far away from the mess Rebecca had made. I accepted the offer without hesitation, feeling lighter than I had in months. The past was behind me now, and I was free to move forward, free from the lies, the betrayal, the ruins of my marriage. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had won. And this time, it wasn't just on paper. It was real. I was finally in control of my life again. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.